Welcome, Bronco Nation. This very exciting series. I got Ron Counts on today, and we're going to be discussing a little series I'm liking to call 10 and 10, where we're going to be covering the top 10 questions facing Boise State football in 10 separate, right about 10-minute segments. I'm, of course, Bronco Blamar. With me today is Ron Counts from the Idaho Statesman. For great Boise State coverage all season long, make sure that you follow Ron. Make sure you follow Idaho Statesman on Twitter. Make sure that you subscribe to my channel, of course. And then Ron is also going to be writing an accompanying article with each of these videos, going a little bit more in depth about what we discussed today. So make sure that you go and subscribe to the Idaho Statesman as well, so you don't miss out on any of that great content. Thank you all for being here, and let's get to the questions. All right, so the question for today is, will a true number one wide receiver emerge for Boise State? Now, post Khalil Shakir, it's been a little bit, I wouldn't say a rough ride here, because a lot of wide receivers have stepped up, but we haven't seen a truly number one wide receiver step up like Boise State has had in the past. I mean, you think back, those Boise State teams, they always had that number one guy, whether it's Hightower or Cedric Wilson or Titus Young or Thomas Spurbeck or Matt Miller, Khalil Shakir. There's always that number one guy. But 2022 was the first time since 2006 that a wide receiver failed to break 700 yards for Boise State. Caples was the closest, 549 yards receiving. But again, I didn't say that there wasn't a receiving game. There was more of a mixed bag spread across the board. 6 wide receivers had 200-plus yards receiving. 3 of them had 300-plus yards receiving. And, of course, there was a heavy focus on the rushing game, so it wasn't an offense that wasn't producing. It was just focusing on a little bit of a different area. Who do you think steps up as that number one wide receiver to fill those shoes? You got a lot of different guys coming back, a lot of guys with different receiving yards. You know, most of those guys I talked about with those 200, 300-plus yards are coming back on the team this year. And you also have some new guys and some hidden faces that might be able to produce as well, some new recruits. So who do you think potentially steps up as that number one?
Well, you're absolutely right about them always having that clear-cut number one guy. Since 2014, Boise State's leading receiver every year has caught at least 50 passes for like you said, right around 700 yards. This past year, that didn't happen, both ways. Latrell Caples did catch 51 balls for 549 yards and 4 touchdowns last year. I think he's probably the safest bet as a guy to come back in and be that number one guy. He's a fast, tough receiver. He's not the biggest guy in the world, but we saw down the stretch last year, he made some Shakir-esque catches. I'm thinking about that San Diego State game where he was on the sideline, tiptoed, made a one-hand catch. So he's a gamer. He's a guy that's going to get a lot of balls thrown his way. Steph Cobbs, another guy who physically is very similar to Latrell Caples, maybe not as thick. He's had some injury concerns. He's a big guy. Steph's a guy who I think needs a little bit more help to create space. He's a guy that you can throw screens to and throw the quick slants to. I'm not sure if he's going to get open a lot on his own. Billy Bowens is an interesting one. He's a veteran. He's a long receiver. He's a good possession guy. I think of him, if you think back to the 90s, Keyshawn Johnson, the old Jets receiver, kind of a possession type guy, the guy you look for on third down. That's Billy Bowens to me. A really interesting one to watch this year of the guys that played a lot last year was Eric McAllister. Young kid, 6'3", almost 200 pounds, big body, deep threat. I think he could take a really, really big step this year. So I think those are 4 names to keep an eye on. But here's 3 more wild cards, 3 guys that maybe people don't really know a lot right now because they haven't seen them on the field. Austin Bolt, who we haven't seen in a couple of years, or last year really because he broke his leg early in the season. Ben Ford, another Idaho kid who had an injury last year. Both of those guys were Gatorade State Players of the Year in Idaho. And then the freshman phenom, Prince Strawn, 6'5", he came in and just has a nose for the ball. He was maybe one of the most impressive players in the spring game. He knows how to high point the ball. So I think he's a guy that's going to see a lot more playing time this year. I really think that guys like Eric McAllister and Prince Strawn are going to see a lot more balls come their way this year. And that could mean a few veterans see a few less.
Do you see a role, someone you didn't mention, do you see a role for Chase Penry, this transfer in from Colorado University? He's experienced in the Power 5. He wasn't their number one guy. I think he had 11 or 10 or 11 receptions during his time there at Colorado. But do you see him having a role in this offense this year?
He certainly could. He's a bit of a mystery right now because we didn't see him in the spring. He missed all of spring ball with an injury that we don't really know about. So we haven't seen him much on the field. Based on his experience, he definitely could. His size, he's about 6 foot, 6'1". I mean, he could play in the slot. He could play outside. So, I think he's a guy early in the season that's going to come in and provide some quality depth. But, does he crack the starting lineup right away? I'm not sure. I can't really answer that without seeing him on the field.
I mean, I was impressed by the growth of Eric McAllister throughout the season. He starts off the year as just kind of a little bit of a deep threat. You know, you throw him on a skinny post and he catches the ball. But even towards the end of the year, you were seeing him more complex routes, being able to make some moves in open space. That catch he had versus North Texas, that was a touchdown. He had to run 20 yards or so through weaving through the defenders to get to the end zone. It is impressive when you look at this roster compared to other Boise State rosters of the past, the height factor on this team. You know, we were talking before the video about the fact that there's only 2 players on this roster that are under 6 foot tall. And in the past, you might have had only 2 players that were over 6 foot tall for Boise State. What's the difference in the focus there? You know, the shift from Boise State where they were kind of looking at the smaller guys, is it just they were getting what they could get? Now they're attracting those larger players, or is there a little bit of a shift in mentality where they're targeting those bigger, larger wide receivers?
I think it's a little bit of both. And really, I think it's just the way the game has gone. You know, athletes are bigger, faster, stronger these days. Defensive backs are getting bigger every year. I mean, think about, 5, 6, 10 years ago, it was unheard of to have a cornerback that was over 6 feet tall. They thought they weren't mobile enough. They'd make them a safety. Now we have corners that are 6'2", 6'3", 6'4". And so you got to have the receivers that can go up and fight those balls. And also, it's a bit of a shift in recruiting philosophy as well. I mean, in the past, Boise State did. Boise State had that reputation of finding the under-recruited, gems, the hidden gems, and turning them into stars. Think about the Thomas Sverbecs of the world, the Kellen Moores, the Matt Millers of the world. These guys weren't lighting the recruiting world on fire. Boise State turned them into stars. Now Boise State, the different coaching staffs have different philosophies. I think they want those bigger guys. I think Boise State has the confidence now to go into a kid's house in Texas and say, hey, we can turn you into an NFL guy. So they're going to go after those bigger, faster athletes. They have to do it.
This is an interesting comparison, but like I said, this is 2006 was the last time that Boise State didn't get a wide receiver over 700 yards. There are some similarities between those two teams. Boise State in 2006 had a mobile quarterback who has been compared to Taylor Green there and Jared Zabransky. They were focused on the rushing game last year, 2749 rushing yards. In 2006, 2,784 yards rushing, and they had a very dominant rushing game there with Ian Johnson in 2006, which compares favorably to Boise State's current rushing game with Lonnie and Genti. And there wasn't a number one wide receiver, but it doesn't mean that there wasn't great wide receivers on the rosters. I mean, you're talking Gerard Rabb, Legedu Nane, Vinny Peretta, Jeremy Childs, and of course, Dryzen James, who led the team receiving that year. So there was a great breadth of receiving, a little bit more of a mixed bag. We talk about who might take over as that number one, and there probably will be someone that steps up as the primary focus. But do you see Boise State with that run-heavy emphasis on offensive running game, offensive play calling, which we've talked about before? Do you see Boise State having a little bit more of a mixed bag of receivers that they're going to versus a true number 1,000-yard threat?
I think so. In part because so many of their top guys are so similar physically. We're talking Latrell Caples, Billy Bowens, Steph Cobbs, even Chase Penry. These guys are very similar athletically. They have very similar skill sets. So if those guys are, 4 of the top 5 receivers on the roster, they're going to spread those catches out. But here's what I think is going to happen this year, especially if Strawn and McAllister come out strong early in the year. I think those 2 guys are going to cement themselves as starters, and some of those veterans like Cobbs, Bowens, maybe even Caples are going to get regulated a little bit more to the slot, more to where maybe they belong, because you can have Strawn 6'5" on one end, McAllister 6'3" on the other end. And if you got an athlete like Caples on the slot with them, I mean, that's a nasty combo. So it's all going to come down to those first 2 weeks. Is the moment too big for Strawn or not? If he comes out and plays well, he's going to see a lot of balls come his way. If not, we're going to see much more of a mixed bag. We're going to see, like we did last year, a lot of guys in the 30 to 50 catch range.
So you see Boise State at least getting one guy over that 700-yard cap that they've traditionally done, but maybe not reaching into the, Hightower, Cedric Wilson, number 1,000-yard receiving game.
Yeah, I don't see a receiver breaking 1,000 here, in part because of the focus on the running game. They're going to run the ball upwards of 40 times a game. That's going to happen this year. So will a guy crack 1,000? I don't think so. But I do think a guy like Latrell Caples or even a Steph Cobbs can get closer to that, 60-catch, 800-yard mark.
Well, it's going to be an exciting season because you look at that 2006 team, they were still an exciting offense with that mixed bag, and that was a championship winning team. And if Boise State can have multiple guys stepping up, I mean, you're throwing around a lot of names there, new guys and former guys on the team that could potentially step up and secure that number 1, number 2 slot or find a role for themselves on this offense. That is exciting that's an exciting picture to look at. I mean, it's been a while since Boise State had two true stars in the wide receiver game playing at the same time. You probably think back to the Titus Young, Austin Pettis, where it wasn't a developmental wide receiver coming up. You had two true seniors playing at the same time and securing a majority of those possessions. So it's going to be interesting seeing the mixed bag that Boise State has available to them. It doesn't mean that Boise State's wide receiver game is going to take a step back. I think that the competition and the multitude of options is actually going to only elevate Taylor Green's game and these guys on the field. So it's going to be an exciting game to watch, exciting season to watch here for Boise State. I think agree with you that Prince Strong or Eric McAllister, the tall guys, eventually end up securing that role. But maybe we see Stephon Cobbs fulfill the potential that was so sore in him after Khalil Shakir left, or maybe one of the other so-called veterans on the team like Caples or Bowens being able to come back and secure it as well. Regardless, Boise State has a deep wide receiver room that they may not be proven, but they have a lot of potential and talent. I'm excited for what they have available. Thanks so much, everybody, for watching. This has been a great video. We've got another 3 that are coming out, so make sure you keep an eye out for them. As always, make sure you like, subscribe, and go Big Blue!